So I want to test you a little bit. We'll see if you can complete this jingle. The best part of waking up is... So if you knew that, congratulations. Like, you watched a lot of TV in the 90s. If you had no idea what that was and what just was said, congratulations. You have the premium subscription streaming services that have no commercials on them. The best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup. That was a jingle made famous by Folgers Coffee Company, and it was accompanied by and made possible to us through a whole bunch of different commercials. I think these were the original like Hallmark style commercials. If you remember, it was like, you know, the one spouse wakes up super early so the other spouse doesn't have to, and then makes the pot of coffee, and the other spouse that's getting the blessing of sleeping in is awoken by the smell, the aroma of the fresh cup of coffee. And then the best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup. You know, I'm thinking through Veterans Day weekend, and, you know, there was a commercial that they ran where somebody comes home from being deployed and sneaks into the house before his wife wakes up, and he wakes her up with surprise by brewing a cup of coffee, and she's awoken by the smell of coffee that's not supposed to happen but happens, and it's a signal that her loved one has returned, right? Or the college kid that drives all night to get home by Christmas miraculously arrives at home like an hour before dawn Christmas morning and wakes his parents up by brewing a brew of coffee, right? This happens in my house, not necessarily with Folgers per se. I like good coffee, just for the record. You know, I have this really cool coffee machine that we bought a few years ago that 5:30 every Sunday morning, man, it clicks on and it grinds my coffee and to the exact fineness that I've set it to, custom roast, right? Hits it with 205-degree temperature water to brew perfectly at the right pace so that when about the time I hit the door coming out of my bedroom on Sunday morning at a little after 6, I smell this fresh roasted, you know, pot of coffee that I get to enjoy. And so like I did this morning, I get to have a little bit of time with Jesus and a sweet, fresh cup of coffee in the morning. But here's the thing, right? This idea, the best part of waking up, if you will, is Folgers in your cup, right? Not the best part of waking up is the smell, the aroma of the fresh brewed coffee, but the aroma of the coffee isn't actually the reward. It isn't actually what we're going for. What we're actually going for and looking forward to is sipping the cup of coffee, enjoying the cup, right? When we approach today, we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 7, and I invite you to turn your Bibles, if you have them, to Hebrews chapter 7. If you're new to Impact, man, this is one of our core values, biblical teaching and preaching, and we like to go verse by verse through books of the Bible. We're in Hebrews. This is week 13, so we've been here for a minute. And we approach today a character, a man by the name of Melchizedek, which we've seen a glimpse of a couple weeks ago, which Justin touched on in chapter 5. And Melchizedek, there's a lot of mystery surrounding Melchizedek and who this guy is and whatever. And we've kind of been working through this book with the overall theme that Jesus is better. We've seen already that the book of Hebrews has been very, very rich, better than Jesus, better than angels, better than Moses. We're looking at Abraham. We're looking at Jesus offers a better rest today, the office of high priest and really the lineage of Jesus, that his family, his reputation, Jesus is better. And in Hebrews chapter 7, man, this guy Melchizedek just shows up like very, very little biblical information that we have about him. And there's a lot of camps on who this guy is and what does he mean. We're going to look at a couple of those today. So it might be dense in sections, but I want to make sure that we're painting the most accurate picture, right? But Melchizedek just kind of shows up. Like no carefully curated Instagram page or LinkedIn profile. This is just bang, he's here. Who is this guy? What does he do? Why does it matter to me? We saw in chapter 5, as Justin emphasized, like he is a priest king, which is the highest a title that we can see in the scriptures, this priest king. And there's only two people in the whole of scriptures that have this title, Jesus and Melchizedek, priest king, very important. But what I want us to see today in Hebrews chapter 7 is that Melchizedek isn't actually the goal. Understanding who Melchizedek is isn't actually the goal. Rather, Melchizedek is like the aroma behind the coffee. He's to whet our appetites, to draw our attention, to lead us to the cup, which is Jesus, to point us to what is better. He's there to open our eyes to see that Jesus is better. We're going to take over the next couple weeks, and really unpack chapter 7 as a whole. We'll see Jesus is the better high priest. He is the better sacrifice. And in verse 25, we'll see eventually that Jesus is the only one who can save. We want to today, as we kind of enter and recognize just our season, right? We're in an age and a time period where everything is about likes and follows and shares. Melchizedek isn't about drawing attention to him. Rather, he is the aroma of Christ to set the stage for Christ, a type of Christ, so that we could draw our attention and our affection and see Jesus for who he is. And so what I want us to see today is that Jesus is the permanent, perfect, and powerful priest. If you like to take notes, you might write that down. We're going to see that in 3 different sections. I'm going to kind of break that down. What does it mean to be the permanent priest, the perfect priest, and the powerful priest? But I want us to recognize that the purpose of Melchizedek is to point us to Jesus, the permanent, perfect, and powerful priest. So we're going to jump in here, Hebrews chapter 7, first 3 verses. We're going to look at just who Melchizedek is, and then in the later couple verses, why is this important? So if you want to read along with me, chapter 7, verse number 1. For this Melchizedek, let me pause there. You're like, 3 words, man. Sorry. The word for there is the same word that's translated therefore many times. And so I just want to back up a couple verses because this is, again, connecting a previously mentioned an idea. So chapter 6, the very last 2 verses in chapter 6, starting in verse number 19, we have this sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So because Jesus has gone into the innermost part of the temple, into the Holy of Holies as a forerunner on our behalf, because Jesus is the anchor of our souls, the offer of hope in the line of Melchizedek, therefore, verse number 1, for this Melchizedek. So this is why we're explaining what's going on. For Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. We'll pause again. It's going to be a while, right? I let them know in the back. I'm just kidding. 2 titles given to Melchizedek that I want us to check out, and I mentioned this just a second ago. He is king and priest. King of Salem. The word Salem there is where we get our word shalom, or the Hebrew word shalom. They're tied to the same Greek word. It means peace. And it actually translates this down in verse number 2 that he is a king of peace. He's king of Salem, that is the king of peace. We've heard of the Prince of Peace, Isaiah chapter 9, the Messiah, the Prince of Peace. Melchizedek, the king of Salem. You've heard of Jerusalem, the city of peace. Make sure those are connected in your head. So he's the king of peace. Priest says of the Most High God. Now this is about to take us into Genesis chapter 14, which we're going to read a second. This is when Melchizedek, he's only mentioned twice in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 14 is one of those, which we'll read from in a minute. This is before the term Yahweh, the title given to God, the covenant God of Israel. This is before Yahweh is even created as a vocabulary. So there's no reference to God as Yahweh. Here's how they would reference the creator God of the universe is the God Most High. So he is priest of the Most High God. And the priest's job, as we've seen before already in the book of Hebrews, the priest's job was to represent the people to God. You remember the prophet spoke on behalf of God to the people. The priest took people's response and brought it back to God. So the priests would receive sacrifices, they would steward the temple, they would receive the tithes, as we'll talk about in great detail today. But to do so, they did so as servants of God. Melchizedek was a servant. He was a priest king. And it says that he met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him, Abraham appointed a 10th part of everything. Let me explain what's going on. This is going to take a second. Brings us back to Genesis chapter 14. Genesis, the book of beginnings, the very first book of the Bible. Early in the Bible, Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abraham. Abram at the time was his name. And he leaves Ur of the Chaldees. He leaves his hometown. And God says, you just go to the land that I'll show you. And he eventually lands in a land where he is in Genesis chapter 14. And he's flourishing. And his flocks are growing. And he's thriving. And so is his family. His nephew by the name of Lot. And he gets to a point where he says to Lot, hey, we can't coexist here, not because we can't get along, but because we're just too big. So you pick whichever land you want to go to, and I'll pick the other. You go one way, I'll go the other way, and we'll continue to flourish. And so that's what happens. Lot goes into a city, you remember the name Sodom. And then what happens with Sodom flourishing, Lot flourishing, is these kings to the north, they kind of get together, and they decide to declare war, and they begin to war against other nations around them, and they win, and one of the cities that is defeated is Sodom. So Abraham, again, his nephew, Lot there, right? But Abraham in a different area, hears about what's going on, hears that Lot's place of living, his residence, they've lost, and the kings, Chedorlaomer, I think is this guy's name, right? They take the spoils, and then so Abraham gets his allies together, and they track him down, and they defeat them. So that's kind of what's happening. And as Abraham defeats them, he takes all of the stuff, all of the increase, all of their flocks, all of their money, and he's bringing it back. And he gets met on that road by the king of Sodom and by Melchizedek. I want to read this to you. Genesis chapter 14. Maybe you want to make a note, do this in your small group. You guys can go back and read it. Genesis 14, starting in verse number 7. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, that's after Abraham's return, and the kings who were with him, right? The king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh. That's the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, we see the title, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. So there we see the title, priest, king, and the title, Most High God. All connected to Hebrews chapter 7. And here's what happened. He blessed him. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And he said, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham, or Abram at the time, gave him a 10th of everything. So on his way home, Abraham has acted as the kinsman redeemer. He's gone as the kinsman to Lot, and he's redeemed everything, and he's won the battle as the Lord has given him victory, and he's gotten all this stuff, and he's bringing it back. And Melchizedek comes out to meet him. And Melchizedek does a couple things. He reminds him first, Abram, the reason you won was because the God Most High allowed you to win. He gave you the victory. The same God who, just a couple chapters earlier, called you out of your land, the same God who called you has now provided victory for you, Abraham. So he's connecting these things together. And he blesses him. And then Abraham responds by giving him a 10th of everything. A 10th of everything is referred to as a tithe, which became a pattern in the Jewish law from the people to the priesthood, which we'll, again, talk about in a second. So if we, again, just recapping, I know that's a lot of backstory, but I want us to catch all of that because it's super important. For Melchizedek, king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God, he met Abraham returning from the slaughter. This is back in Hebrews 7. Abraham appointed a 10th of everything. Then it begins to explain who Melchizedek is. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness. That's his name and how it translates. King of righteousness, or you might say, my king is righteous. King of righteousness. And he's also king of Salem, that is king of peace. Righteousness and peace. And I don't have time to fully unpack that, but let me just say you cannot have true peace without righteousness. The two go together. King of righteousness, King of peace. And then it says, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. But resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. So he's without, this is speaking of Melchizedek, he's without father, he's without mother, he's without genealogy. Neither beginning of days nor end of life, priest forever. This is where it gets confusing. And this is where, in many cases, the wheels fall off. This is where there's lots of theological debate. We have to be able and willing, if you remember back in week number 1, where I said when we study Hebrews, we've got to be able to hold some tension. We've got to be willing to hold some tension because there's some unknowns here. There's a lot of different theories on who Melchizedek is. There's 2 primary theories. I kind of lean towards one, but I'm okay with you holding either. Let me explain briefly. The first one is that Melchizedek would be a Christophany. Christophany means that some would believe that Melchizedek is an appearance of Jesus as the pre-incarnate Christ. So in John chapter 1, when we see the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, Jesus being birthed as a baby, Christophany would be before that. Now this helps hold together some of our Trinitarian theology that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are co-equal, co-eternal. Right? So Jesus would be eternal. That would mean there never was a time in which Jesus was not, and there never will be a time in which Jesus is not. But he took on flesh at a certain point. Prior to that, the belief here of Christophany is that in this pre-existent state that he could and did, if you hold to this theory, right, this view, that he could appear to humans in certain form. Right? So this would be the Christophany view would be that Melchizedek was actually Jesus who took on the king priest and showed up in person as Melchizedek, right? So that we would get to see and experience and point to his later lineage, right? And there's an incredible amount of support for this view. Like, I don't have a problem with this view if that's the way you want to go. Namely, when we look, there's no father, there's no mother, there's no genealogy, so there's no genealogical records. Pretty much every major character that we see in the scripture has a genealogical record that's recorded in the scriptures, so we know where they're from. That's lacking with Melchizedek, which supports this theory. Right? There's no beginning of days or end of life. That also supports the Christophany theory. He's a priest forever. Right? For me, the most convincing part of this view of Jesus, Melchizedek being a Christophany, is that he is titled priest king, which we only see with Jesus. Makes sense. The second view, which is really where I land a little bit, again, I can hold the tension there, would be that Melchizedek is a historical type. Now, let me explain what that means. It means Melchizedek was a real person. He was a real historical priest king who existed at the time of Abraham. He was there. He was intentionally presented without genealogy. So he's highlighted and referenced to prefigure Christ's eternal priesthood. Therefore, he is a type or a foreshadow of Jesus, the priest king. He is the aroma that leads us to the cup. And so when I look at verse number 3, and it says he's without father, mother, genealogy, like I'm more inclined to hold this view for a couple reasons, because the way that the grammar shows up, he's without mother or father, without genealogy, beginning of days, this is more referencing, I believe, his priesthood, not his personhood. So it doesn't mean that he didn't literally have a mom or a dad. It just means they were of no nobility, of no noteworthiness. So he was a priest called by God and appointed by God, but not because he was a birthright, right? It wasn't because he was of a certain family lineage or he had a reputation or his mom or his dad was somebody. Rather, just solely based on God's call on his life. This is in stark contrast to the way priests were designed in the Levitical temple. Again, I know I'm giving you tons of stuff. Sorry. It'll all, hopefully, at least in my head, wrap up together. We'll see. If not, I'm sorry. enjoy the bye week for the Cowboys. Right? Here's how priests were chosen in the Levitical temple, which would come later. Right? It was all about birthright. So we have priests were priests because they were of the tribe of Levi. In fact, when you go to the book of Ezra, if you remember in the book of Ezra, Israel had been displaced for a significant amount of time. They go back into Jerusalem, and they find Jerusalem and the temple, therefore, in shambles. And a guy by the name of Nehemiah plans this building project, right? And part of this building project is to restore everything, but it also includes restoring the temple, and therefore the temple sacrifices. And what they needed for that to take place was a priest, a high priest. And they went around looking for somebody to be a priest. And there was several qualified candidates who said, hey, I can do this. Like, I think I'm of the right family, or I have the right seniority. Like, I think I can make this happen. And here's basically what happens is they say, show us your papers. They're like, prove it. We're not interested in somebody who thinks that they might be maybe capable, or that has the right person or the right look or the right experience. We solely are interested in somebody who's in the tribe of Levi. Right? So this is how priests were determined, and specifically who could be the high priests. So it wasn't based on anything else other than their birthright. Melchizedek, again, we don't know anything about his family, but what we do know is that he was called by God. He was a priest of the Most High God. So his priesthood had nothing to do with lineage. It had everything to do with calling. And the focus is on the permanency, not of Melchizedek as a person, but on the permanency of Melchizedek's priesthood, the order of Melchizedek as it's presented several different times. So when we look back at chapter 6 in those last couple verses, you remember what it says, a high priest forever, speaking of Jesus, after the order of Melchizedek. When we looked at chapter 5 just a couple weeks ago, you can turn back, page 20 if you've got your journaling Bible, just a couple pages back. Chapter 5, Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, it says, for every high priest chosen among men is not appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, or is appointed, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called upon God, just as Aaron was. So Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said, this is a quotation of Psalm 2, we looked at this already, you are my son, today I've begotten you. God the Father appoints God the Son. And he also says in another place, you are priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. This priest king. Jesus, point number 1, is the permanent priest. Melchizedek foreshadows Jesus. He's the aroma. The best part of waking up by the smell is to get to enjoy the cup. Melchizedek was never intended to be the permanent solution. It is not the permanent solution, rather the aroma leading to the solution. Jesus is the permanent priest. Therefore, when you feel uncertain, abandoned, when you feel alone, know that Jesus will never stop caring for you. His love for you will never run out. It will never expire. It will never be replaced. Jesus, the permanent priest, will be your advocate forever. Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come. Jesus is our permanent priest. Second, we see that Jesus is the perfect priest. Back to Hebrews 7, verse number 4. See how great this man was. This is speaking of Melchizedek's. See how great Melchizedek was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers. Though these are also descendants of Abraham, but this man who does not have his descendants from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. So we've established already that Melchizedek didn't come from anyone known, no father or mother or genealogy of any remark, right, of any regard. And Melchizedek reigned as priest king during the time of Abraham, Genesis 14. That Abraham, returning from victory, as we read, encounters Melchizedek, who then does two things, and two things happen here. Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives him a tithe. When he blesses him, when Melchizedek blesses Abraham, it says here in Hebrews chapter 7 that this is beyond dispute, meaning culturally, logically, for a long period of time, no debate, that the lesser is always blessed by the greater. So whoever's greater in that area would then bless the lesser. Nobody debated this. This is very clear, a very clear understanding. And Abraham, it says in verse number 4, and it actually has in the Greek language here, it has the definite article to show the patriarch. And when you look at this in the Greek, the patriarch is actually at the very end of the sentence to elevate who Abraham is. Now, Abraham isn't a patriarch. He's not one of the fathers. This is Abraham, the father, right? Father Abraham is how we kind of sang the song as we were growing up. Sorry, you're going to be singing it for a while. It's just in your head if you know it. Right? This is Abraham, the patriarch. He is like the key figure in Israel's lineage, the beginning, the covenant receiver from God, Genesis chapter 12, the father of many nations, the ones whoever Abraham blesses will be blessed, and all the nations on the earth will be blessed through Abraham. And yet, Melchizedek blesses Abraham. The way that this is lined up to put Melchizedek in an inferior role. So based on that, Melchizedek would be greater or better than Abraham. He's blessed by Abraham, and Abraham gives Melchizedek a tithe, a tenth. So for those that don't know, you may be in church, you may not be in church. A tithe is literally just means by definition 10%, and this was the practice, what Abraham does, and later became a rule, a law in the Levitical law that the Jews would give a tenth of all of their income or all of their increase. So for us today, it would be like, hey, if we're practicing a tithe, we would get a paycheck. Whatever our paycheck was, we would give 10% of that to the church. Like that's a normal practice. It's practiced often. We actually practice this in our home. We give a tithe, not because of a rule now, but because of a mentality of generosity that we foster in our own lives, of giving back to God, right? Showing God that we can live on the 90% of what he's entrusted to us. That's where this is all birthed in giving a tithe. Now, in Abraham's day, they didn't have a paycheck, right? Rather, it was their increase. So when one king would war with another king and they would win, and they would take all the stuff, livestock, money, whatever, then all of that increase, they would give a tenth of that. And so Abraham gives a tenth to Melchizedek. Why is this a big deal? Because in the Levitical law, again, if we start with Abraham has finally a son, Isaac. You remember that. We talked about Isaac before. Isaac, the promised son, who then has another son named Jacob. Jacob ends up having 12 sons, and those 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. The fourth son of Jacob is the son of Levi. Levi was God's chosen to put the priesthood in the tribe of Levi. So think forward a minute. Whenever Israelites finally cross the Jordan River, they go into the promised land. We have all of these sons, and Joshua's leading them, and And here's how God splits it up so we don't have an Abraham-Lot situation again where we're overbearing on each other's land. God says, hey, we're going to split this up, and I'm going to designate certain lands to certain tribes so that everybody knows clearly what's going on. And you would think because he has 12 sons, he's going to split this up into 12, but he doesn't. He actually splits it up into 11. And the tribe of Levi doesn't get any of that. Why? Because that's the tribe of the priesthood, in which Aaron would eventually be the first high priest. And they would receive tithes from their brothers, as it points out in Hebrews 7. From the other tribes would receive tithes, the increase, to cover all of those expenses, which would include stewarding the temple and all of the things within that. So we have this whole thing laying up where here in Hebrews chapter 7 points us back to Genesis 14, where we see that Abraham paid a tithe and that Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Melchizedek, no family to speak of, shows up, this priest king of righteousness, of peace, this typology that's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. Earthly priests who were sinners, Jesus who is sinless. Earthly priests who would need to make a substitute sacrifice on their own behalf before they could go into the inner room. Jesus who was the sacrifice, the substitute sacrifice, who was, as we saw in chapter 6 and just these verses leading up to this, who was the one who went into the inner, into the Holy of Holies, who tore the veil, who opened the opportunity for us to fellowship with God. Right? Jesus was that role. Let me take you back to Hebrews chapter 4 again. Again, some of this we've covered. I just want us to connect all these dots because it's an amazing book. Jesus, the high priest, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace in our time of need. Jesus is the perfect priest. If you've ever wondered in a season of uncertainty why your prayers, maybe, are my prayers even good enough? Does God hear my prayers? Am I saying the right words? Have I done the right things? Here's what we see with Jesus, the perfect priest. He opened the veil so that we can boldly go to God, so that we can approach God directly with Jesus, our intercessor. It tells us in James chapter 5 that the prayers of a righteous man can accomplish much. And I don't know about you, but I am so thankful that I do not stand in my own righteousness in that moment. Rather, on the King of righteousness, Jesus, the only one who is righteous, who stands in our behalf. So our standing before God, our prayers before God, they're not based on our own worthiness. They're not based on anything we can do, but rather solely on Jesus, on Jesus' accomplished work on the cross. Jesus is the perfect priest. Lastly, Jesus is the powerful priest. Melchizedek's greatness illustrated again by Abraham, the patriarch, the father of all Israel. This tithe given to Melchizedek from Abraham indicating inferiority. Abraham honoring Melchizedek by being blessed, right? Levi and subsequent, as it tells us, subsequent tribes honored Melchizedek because they were in the loins. This is a normal thing we see in the scriptures where multiple generations are referenced in a singular person. Right? Melchizedek's priesthood is unmatched in authority and power, and it is meant to resemble, to draw us to give us the aroma of Jesus. And the key to all of that is in verse number 3. It says, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. This man Melchizedek, who was a man, has now in our days kind of become a myth. Who is this guy? What's the deal? And he points to Jesus, the Messiah, who somehow was a myth that actually became a man. Jesus became the priest king in the order of Melchizedek. But Melchizedek was there to resemble the Son of God. Melchizedek's whole role was to resemble Jesus, the ultimate priest king. And Jesus' priesthood is unmatched in authority and power, and it brings real access to God, real blessing from God, real transformation. Jesus doesn't just mediate forgiveness. He offers a permanent solution to our problem of sin. The power to change hearts, to restore lives, to provide peace, to comfort the brokenhearted relies solely upon Jesus. So if you're stuck in a cycle of sin, stuck in a cycle of anxiety, of guilt, and you need power, a real breakthrough, Jesus offers more than any momentary relief or fix or high, rather freedom and blessing and victory. Jesus is the permanent, perfect, and powerful priest. Melchizedek's a little bit mysterious, right? Sometimes confusing, but for sure not the main point. When I get up in the morning, I love being greeted by the smell, but I'm not looking forward to just smelling it. I want to have that cup of coffee. It smells nice, but it's never satisfying in and of itself. In the same way, Melchizedek, his story is meant to awaken us, not to satisfy us, to give us the aroma, but not to be the cup. The cup, the real satisfaction, is Jesus himself. I don't know where you find yourselves today, but maybe today you're here and you find yourselves chasing the smell, the aroma. You like being in the presence, but you're not fully sipping of the cup. You're not really tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. Maybe you're longing for reassurance that God will never stop loving you. Maybe you feel your past is kind of messy, and that kind of disqualifies you from even being there. Maybe you just wish for real power to break free from a burden that you've carried. Jesus is ready right now to be your perfect, permanent, and powerful priest. So don't settle for less when Jesus is better. Come to him and let him meet you where you are and do things that only he can do. Let's pray together.